clarity, and if you actually raise some good objections to the critic's view, very often there's silence. And this cuts across all faiths, it cuts across all levels of society, all different types of YouTube channels, whether it be political or theology or philosophy or apologetics, so on and so forth, right? There's very little reflection, and there's no structure. And there's no awareness of how they arrived at their conclusion. So just think about that for a second. When was the last time you thought about what you believe and subjected what you believe to some criticism? Have you reflected upon what you believe and tried to raise maybe an objection to that belief? Just as a sidebar here, right? This is the Catholic intellectual tradition. Part of being educated is to form one's beliefs, to arrive at knowledge under the pressures of criticism. Thomas Aquinas is a perfect example, his Summa. He always raised objections to frame the question itself. Is there a God? Does God exist? He raises the problem of evil. He raises the problem of naturalism. And so Thomas is thinking about his own beliefs under this sort of self-reflective, critical approach. Now, being critical is not the same thing as being a critic, right? Being skeptical doesn't necessarily make one a skeptic. Okay, so what's the point I'm making here? The point I'm trying to drive home is that too often we believe that there's something wrong with other people's reasoning, but we will spend very little, if no time, on our own reasoning. And that's a problem. Okay. And if I may just offer one small rant, something I see constantly is the casual accusation that someone is lying, specifically when someone's charged with misinformation, quote unquote. And so I want to mention something I saw again just last week. Someone in a video on YouTube was accused of lying. But when the accuser played the clip, all that actually happened was this. The person was asked what they thought. And they gave their opinion. Now, maybe their opinion was wrong. Right? Perhaps it was mistaken. But that is not the same thing as lying. And moreover, when the accuser was saying that the person in the video was lying, it was done in a mocking attitude. A dismissive attitude. Well, when you're so quick to point out someone else's mistake, you commit your own mistakes, because this is not lying. We need to recover the distinction. Lying is not the same thing as saying something's wrong. To lie means to intend to deceive. To lie is to say something you believe to be false in order to mislead someone else. However, if a person honestly holds a belief and simply states it, then even if that belief turns out to be false, they are not lying. Again, they may be incorrect, but that's very different from deception. And so what logic will show us, hopefully as we contemplate and think about these things on the Thomistic Mind, we should be careful with our words, how we think. And that goes for all of us, right? Not every error is a lie. Not every disagreement is dishonesty. And if we continue to fail to distinguish the two, we lose the ability to have rational discourse, rational dialogue, rational conversation at all. So we need to think about distinctions, we need to keep in mind our thoughts, we need to be reflective, and we need to be logical, rational, reasonable. So with that in mind, I invite you to really engage today. Take notes, slow down your thinking, listen carefully, put your thinking caps on. Because for many of you, this may be your first structured, organized introduction to the nature of logic. And our first key concept in logic is this. It's the argument. The argument. Now, that's what I don't mean a disagreement. I don't mean a fight. But something precise, something structured, that's foundational to all our reasoning. And so arguments in logic must be distinguished from verbal disagreements or shouting matches and other forms of interpersonal conflict. Philosophical arguments do not, hopefully, result in fisticuffs. So it's not a disagreement, it's something else. It's structured, it's a reasoning. So let's begin. What is an argument? Well, an argument isn't just a series of statements. It's not just a group of thoughts. It's not just a bunch of claims. An argument is a structured, ordered group of statements, propositions. The goal of this structured group is to appeal to the mind. An argument is an appeal to the mind. To get your mind, to get you to see the truth and to avoid falsity. And so this appeal to the mind, to the appeal to reason, is distinct from an appeal to emotion, to sentiment, to bias, to self-interest, superstition, prejudice, and so on. And so you can see right off the bat, the argument is a controversial topic. Why? Because arguments are not appealing to someone's emotions. The argument isn't trying to appeal to non-rational factors. Now that doesn't mean that these non-rational factors don't resist, and we'll get into that in here in a little bit. Right? But the argument isn't trying to appeal to how you feel about something. What your, say, cultural or individual bias or preference is. It's not appealing to what you want. It's not appealing to your superstitions. No, an argument is an appeal trying to convince you by using your mind. And get the mind to what? To see truth and avoid falsity. So, if an argument is a structured group of statements and propositions, then we need to make a distinction, and that's a I think I've mentioned this before. If I haven't, or if I have, I should say, it's always worth repeating. One of the windows into learning philosophy is to learn distinctions, learn to distinguish. And so if you start to distinguish and be able to say this is not that, you'll go a long way to becoming more philosophical. It won't make you an academic philosopher, but you'll be more philosophical. And it's always a good thing to be more philosophical. Okay. So, we have to make a distinction here. We have to distinguish types of sentences. We have to distinguish sentences full stop from sentences that are statements or propositions. Right, so what's a sentence? A sentence is going to be a group of words, right, that follow some grammatical rules, linguistic rules, syntax, right, that express ideas and thoughts, something like that. And so statements are like that, right? All statements, propositions, are sentences. All statements or propositions are sentences. But not all sentences are statements and propositions. So simply because something's a sentence doesn't make it a statement. But if it's a statement, it's got to be a sentence. Now, if you just joined us, this is the Thomistic Mind with Dr. Jason Reed, and we're diving into understanding logic, because these shows, the Thomistic Mind, is really to help you develop a Thomistic mind. Right? It reminds me of what G.K. Chesterton talked about in the beginning of the book of the Dumb Ox, when he talks about how saints are the most countercultural. Right? Saints, for the time that they're in, are the most countercultural. They're not what the culture wants, what the culture needs. And we live in a time that's very anti-intellectual. We live in a time that's very much all appeal to emotions, all appeal to superstitions, all appeal to biases, constantly trying to grift and market. And so Chesterton writes, of course this is almost a century ago, nothing's changed in that regard, that Thomas is the most intellectual. Thomas is the most philosophical, mentally sophisticated. And so that's why we're going to appeal to him. So in order to develop a Thomistic mind, before we dive into the nuances of Thomas's thought, how Thomas is a thinker for today, we need to really look at what does it mean to be rational? What does it mean to be logical? So that's why we're really spending some time on this. Really want this to sink in, because it's life-changing. It's great stuff. Okay. All right. So back to the lesson. Back to our talk. So not all sentences are statements, but all statements are sentences. So statements or propositions, and I'll use statement here from on out. Right? Statements and propositions are synonymous. Right? They're the same thing. So a statement is a sentence, but it's a sentence that has a truth value. A statement is a sentence that has a quote-unquote truth value. Now, by truth value, we mean that the sentence can be either true or false. A sentence that has a truth value can be either true or false. So if a sentence is false, it has a truth value. Why? Because falsity is one of the two truth values. The other being truth, of course. So if a sentence is true, then it has a truth value. If a sentence is false, it has a truth value. Sentences that do not have a truth value, that is, sentences that cannot be, or are not, and cannot be true or false, they're not statements. They're not propositions. So let's put our thinking caps here and think about and consider the following sentences. And it looks like I've got 6 here. Again, consider the following sentences. It is snowing outside. Would you open the door? Christ established the church. Clean your room. Paul wrote Hebrews. Ouch! So let's analyze those sentences, shall we? And let's see, does it make sense to affirm or deny them? The first, it is snowing outside. Can that be true or false? The answer is yes. It's either true that it's snowing outside, or it's false that it's snowing outside. So if the statement, it is snowing, is uttered, you can say true, or you can say false. That would be an appropriate answer or response to that statement. What about, would you open the door? Is it possible to say true? Would you open the door? False. Would you open the door? True. The answer is no, it doesn't have a truth value, right? That's a question. So sentences that are questions, they're not true or false. You would say yes or no, right? Would you open the door? Yes. Would you open the door? No. So it calls for a response, not for whether or not it's true or false. Would you open the door? True. That doesn't work. And so would you open the door is a sentence, but it's not a statement. Next one. Christ established the church. Is that true or false? Yes. This is how Catholics debate non-Catholic Christians, right? Christians think this is true. Christ established the church, and we have it with us today. Non-Catholic Christians, in particular Protestants, evangelicals, they will say something like that, but they don't believe that there's this visible, hierarchical Roman Catholic Church. And so they would say, in that sense, the statement is false. So Christ established a church, you can say true. Christ established a church, you can say false. And so therefore, that sentence is a statement. Clean your room. False. Doesn't work. Clean your room. True. Clean your room does not have a truth value. You don't give truth value. What's the response? Either yes I will, or no I will not. So clean your room is an imperative. It's a command. And so while it is a sentence, it is not a statement. And so it does not have a truth value. And finally, the last two, Paul wrote Hebrews. Thomas Aquinas says yes, true. Many modern Bible critics say false. False. So Paul wrote Hebrews has a truth value, and therefore that sentence is a statement. And then finally, ouch. True? Ouch. False? No, this is not this sentence, one word sentence, is an expression of pain. It's an exclamation. If you remember from your old School of Rock days, those old cartoons, right? Great, that's one of my kids' favorites. So it's not true or false. It expresses pain. It expresses, right, some sort of negative feeling or emotion. Okay, so what's the takeaway from all this talk? Okay, well, this is something that's really going to help clarify your thinking. Really help you as you're driving home, or you're thinking about this stuff, you're listening to this talk, you're listening to this broadcast, right? What I want you to take away is this, that when you're thinking about an argument, whether it be St. Paul's giving an argument, or the church is giving an argument, or a bishop is giving an argument, or an apologist is giving an argument, or an atheist is giving an argument, or you want to give an argument, only statements can go to make up an argument. Only statements form an argument. That is, only sentences that can be either true or false make up an argument. And there's something key, something else to really notice about the nature of statements. Maybe you saw this. What distinguishes statements from non-statements? Statements make assertions. Statements make assertions about reality. They make claims about what is. They make claims about what is not real, what is or is not the case. And so this is important when it comes to making sense of arguments. What logic is going to be looking at, right? Arguments assert things. Arguments assert truths about reality. And so this really speaks to the ability of an argument to cut through personal opinions, feelings, interests, emotions, prejudice, superstitions, etc., etc. Because the statements what's matter. I was actually just signed a paper for philosophy class, and I asked the students, should you put this in the first person? And we started talking about that, and the student said, whether you believe it or not, it's irrelevant. Right? Whether this is my opinion, it doesn't matter. Either the argument's a good one or it's not. Either the claims are true or they're not. I'm like, that's perfect. Right? That's exactly right. That's what's so beautiful about arguments. So beautiful about statements. Right? You have sentences that express your personal opinion. Fine. There are statements or sentences that express your feelings. That state your interests, emotions, etc., etc. For an argument, that's all irrelevant. Now, again, this is an ideal, right? Not all. We get in the way, right? Obviously, our personal opinions, people's feelings, interests, etc., etc., does get in the way of listening to the argument. But that's not a problem with arguments. Right? That's not the argument isn't the problem, it's the one who's considering it. And so, this important feature of arguments, that they're made as statements, that is, this important feature of arguments, the types of statements that they make up, show us that the argument is trying to appeal to your mind. How so? Okay, well, in an argument, you've got statements, but we have to distinguish there are different types of statements that make up an argument. In an argument, one of the statements we call the conclusion of the argument. And the other statements are called the premises of the argument. And so this distinction between conclusion and premises is a good way of plummeting or diving into the rational, the reasonable aspect of arguments, the appeal to the mind. And this is where we get the objective nature of an argument. The objective nature of argument. Now we're coming here to the end of our first segment. So we're in the middle of talking about statements and how they go to make up an argument and how arguments appeal to the mind. And so how is an argument objective? Well, because again, it's made of statements. One statement's the conclusion, the other statements are premises. And the job of the argument, the task of the argument, the work of the argument, is to correctly infer conclusions from the premises. Think about a court case. When you have a plaintiff, the job of the plaintiff's case is so that the jury rightly concludes the argument that they want. And so what does the lawyers do? They give premises to help people infer something from it. And this is just what proof is. Right? Proof is an objective feature of truth and false statements and their organization. Right? So they're starting to see the scientific aspect or the objective and artful side of arguments. That is, an argument and inference is an objective feature just of the nature of truth and falsity itself. And there's a certain organization and structure that's, again, it's objective, that allows inferences to be correctly performed. Now, there's a distinction here between what the argument is doing and whether or not a person happens to be persuaded. All right, so I'm just going to say a little bit about that before the break, and I'll dive more into that after the break. But the point I'm making here, and just to wrap up this first segment, is that there's too much non-critical thinking going on. There's so much opinions and attacks and sloppy and unclear thinking. This world today, there's so much quick to judge other people's thoughts, very little reflective thought in themselves. One of the antidotes to all this stuff going on is logic. Again, one of the cures for having more reasonable and thoughtful and respectful conversation is for us to be trained in logic, for us to understand the nature of the rational enterprise. Right? There's so much substitution for logical thinking. What's substituted for it? The grifting, the name-calling, the mischaracterizations, the lack of distinctions, and so on and so forth. So that's segment 1 of today's episode. We're going to have a short break here. Please stay with us. And on the other end, I will do a deeper dive into the distinction between being persuaded and something being proven. The Church teaches that a solid education and grounding in philosophy is necessary to find the truth and avoid error, to understand the mysteries of divine revelation, to grasp the Church's doctrine, and to engage an unbelieving world. Philosophy is so valued by the Church that she requires it to form the intellectual life of her priests. Read Thomas is an online program created to make this intellectual formation more widely accessible. Developed and taught by Dr. Jason Reed, the courses combine academic rigor with a spirit of faith, presenting the great themes of classical and Thomistic philosophy in a way that is clear, structured, and faithful to the Catholic intellectual tradition. Participants encounter fundamental questions of philosophy through topics such as the pursuit of wisdom, an introduction to philosophy, an overview of philosophy's origins, methods, and enduring questions. There's He Who Is, examining the classical view of God's attributes and their theological and spiritual implications. We also have the mystery of existence, the philosophy of creation, exploring the metaphysical principles underlying the doctrine of creation. Then we have the three-person God, the mystery of God's inner life, a philosophical study of the Trinity's interrelations. There's also St. Thomas Aquinas' philosophy of the angels, where we consider the nature and role of spiritual beings in Thomistic thought, and further courses that engage the treasures of the Catholic intellectual tradition. Read Thomas seeks to cultivate not only knowledge, but also a deeper appreciation of the harmony between faith and reason, helping participants enter more fully into the wisdom of St. Thomas Aquinas and the Church's philosophical heritage. The website is www.readthomist.com. That's www.readthomist.com. The email is read.thomist@gmail.com. That's reed.thomist@gmail.com. At Read Thomist, we believe the life of the mind is for every Christian. Welcome to the second half of today's broadcast, today's episode, where we're looking at and beginning the nature of logic by thinking about, reflecting upon, and considering the structure and the nature of arguments, nature of an argument. Or as we said before the break, an argument is an attempt, right? Its job is to try to persuade the reader or the listener that a conclusion is true. And to persuade someone that the conclusion is true by appealing to the mind, by using other statements called premises, they're said to entail the conclusion. And we're going to talk a lot more about that coming up. This is trying to give you just a big picture idea of what an argument is. Okay? These arguments are, because they're comprised of statements, because the premises and conclusions are statements that make claims and make assertions about reality, make statements about what is and what is not true. Arguments are objective. And this is what was so appealing to that young student at the local university. He wanted to understand the nature of reasoning, the objective feature of reasoning, so he could do what? So he could start to think for himself. Right? Again, with these arguments, and the understanding of an argument doesn't tell you what to think, it tells you how to properly think. However, there's a big difference, and this is an important distinction, between arguments that have this objective feature of proving something or demonstrating something from whether or not someone is being persuaded. So here's an important distinction we need to make. There is a distinction between being persuaded and being proven. What is persuasion? Well, persuasion is something that happens in the mind or even the will of the listener or the reader. Persuasion is something that's subjective. Right? Persons are persuaded. People are persuaded. Not arguments. So that's why it's subjective. Now, this is not the same thing as subjectivism. We're not saying that persuasion is what makes a good argument. We're not saying, well, if I'm persuaded, therefore I've shown the argument being bad. That's a key distinction. You will see this all the time in debates. Particularly, you see apologist debate. Apologists debating, say, non-believers, skeptics, atheists, so on and so forth. There's this idea that if someone says, well, I'm not persuaded, somehow that matters. Somehow that's a refutation. So hopefully follow what I'm saying. I'm trying to be clear, but this is a fine distinction. right? Not being persuaded is not an objective, it's not an objective objection. That is, simply because someone isn't persuaded, that's not in any way an argument against another argument. That's simply when someone says they are not persuaded, that's something that's a subjective truth about them. And so, of course, if someone's not persuaded, you can ask, well, why aren't you persuaded? And they might say, I'm not persuaded because they don't think the argument's a good one. So that's true. So that'd be a good reason not to be persuaded. Right? So, but being persuaded is something whether the person, the subject, is going to agree. However, someone may be persuaded because they like the speaker. Someone might be persuaded because they dislike the alternative. Or simply because they are impressed, they might be intimidated, or emotionally moved. And we see a lot of this when we have, say, post evaluation of say, debates. Say, who won the debate? And what they'll do is they'll hand around cards, or they'll have some way of calculating votes, and they'll determine who won the debate by how many people were persuaded. And that's a terrible way of deciding who won the debate. And you see a lot of that. How does that shape debates? When we focus too much on persuasion, you'll see how that negatively affects the debating participants, because they might dress a certain way, they might present a certain way, that they're going to present themselves in such a way that becomes impressive. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Now, I'm not saying that you should become less impressive to make a good argument. I'm not saying that you shouldn't try to persuade someone. If that's what you hear me saying, let me just be crystal clear then. Of course you should try to persuade something. You should give an argument that does move one's emotions. That's all called rhetoric. However, but at the end of the day, your argument, or the argument, stands or falls on its own. What rhetoric does is that it gets the person to be interested in your argument, gets interested in your ideas, gets interested in hearing you talk. So again, when I teach capstones at the university and the seminary, I try to get the capstone presenter to present in such a way that you are likable, that you are impressive, that it moves the audience. But to keep in mind, that doesn't mean your argument's a good one. Doesn't mean you're going to get an A, for example. Because in contrast to that, a proof or an argument is objective. An argument shows that a conclusion logically follows from its true premises. Whether anyone likes it or not, whether anyone feels persuaded by it or not, right? Liking and being persuaded is irrelevant. A proof stands even if no one in the room believes it. To sort of drive home this distinction between persuasion and proof, here's a real life example. So on the internet, I don't know exactly when this began, but there is an actor, and I'm sure some of you probably are familiar with this, but there's an actor who has some videos online who argues that 1 times 1 is 2. And so his argument is that much of mathematics has been, in our economic system and all these things are based upon a flawed view of math. What's the correct view according to this actor? 1 times 1 is 2. Now, whether they're an actor or not is irrelevant. That would be ad hominem. I'm just saying to kind of give you some context. Now, when you watch the presentation, it's full of confusion. It's full of wordplay. And it's chock full of sleight of hand. Now, I'm not sure if this person who argues for this understands that. Right? I'm simply saying that the confusion, the wordplay, and the sleight of hand are objective features of the presentation. For example, we start off with 1 times 1 equals 2, and then he moves to 1 action times 1 action, and it just starts to get really confused. Wait a minute, I thought we were talking about numbers and that sort of sleight of hand. Now we're talking about events and multiplying them. So it's just very odd. And how did I come to hear about this? Well, I met someone who had watched these videos and was persuaded that 1 times 1 is 2. And so I was quite surprised. And so, not only surprised, but really eager to have a conversation, because this seemed like something interesting to talk about. So I asked, excuse me, just get to wet my whistle there. So I asked this person I met, what are the reasons, right? What was the reason for this person arguing that 1 times 1 is 2? The answer I received was, well, he's really smart, and people are unfair to him, people are attacking him, people are being mean, and maybe we've been wrong all the time. Now notice what happened. There was no argument given. There was no proof mentioned. There's only this emotional association. And so knowing that, I'm thinking, okay, so this person has an emotional association with the speaker or the thinker, and therefore I'm going to have to tread lightly. I cannot be dismissive. So, but again, I wanted to hear the argument. So I asked again, okay, that's interesting, but what is the reasoning? What is the argument that was given? And the response was, I can't remember, but I think he's possibly right. I never actually got the argument. So I was encouraged to go watch the video for myself. Go watch the video and come back. And so here we have persuasion, which doesn't seem to be with any proof. Right? Here's someone being persuaded, but can't even tell you the proof behind it. And that was sort of more evidence of this emotional association. That is, as this person I met was listening to this author talk, an emotional bond was taking place between him and this actor. And so before I go into my response to this man, let's clarify the actual mathematics. Okay, let's classify what exactly is multiplication. So please forgive this rudimentary, but this is interesting. It's important. Right? This is why clear concepts, understanding statements, understanding the ideas is important. So what is multiplication? Well, multiplication is an arithmetic operation. It's basically repeated addition. Right? Multiplication is repeated addition. So if you have 1 times 4, then you would write the number 1 4 times, and then you would add them. 1 times 4, I'm getting ahead of myself. 1 times 4 means write the number 1 4 times. 1, 1, 1, 1. And then you add them to get 4. So 1 times 4 is 4. 1 times 3 means write the number 1 3 times and add them together. So 1, 1, 1, add them together, you get 3. 1 times 2 is write 2 twice, add it 2. Now, so then what is 1 times 1? 1 times 1 simply means write 1 1 time. And so when it gets to 1 times 1, there's nothing to add. The answer is just 1. Right. 1 times 1 means write 1 1 time. And therefore there's no adding. That's what multiplication is. Okay, so that's a little refresher course in math. I attempted to demonstrate the error of this claim that 1 times 1 equals 2 logically. And so here's my argument. So I'm trying to keep it objective. So here's what I said. Well, okay, I got a piece of paper out, I said if 1 times 1 is 2, then 11 times 1 would have to be 22. Because 11 is just 1 repeated 11 times. And 1 times 1 would have to equal 2. So if you take 1 times 1, that's 2. 1 times the other one, that's 2. 1 times 11 is 22. That's what logically follows from this statement that 1 times 1 equals 2. Now this leads, and again this is my next part of the argument, this leads to absurd consequences. For example, if I make $11 per hour, and if I only worked 1 hour, my paycheck should be $22. Or if I went to I went to the local gas station and I bought one chocolate bar for $1, I would owe $2. So this was an attempt. These are logical consequences of this statement that 1 times 1 equals 2 that leads to absurdities. And of course, what's the conclusion? That it has to be false. If 1 times 1 equals 2 leads to absurdities, then we must reject it. Now, even after showing this contradiction, even showing the absurd consequences, to my surprise, the person I was speaking with was not persuaded. I was quite surprised. And why weren't they persuaded? Because the belief that the person formed isn't based upon proof. They were being loyal to the speaker. They kept defending the speaker, and they felt that I was attacking the speaker. I'm like, I'm not attacking. I'm just showing here's what happens if we accept this idea that's being promoted. And so it was really tough, to be honest with you. The person I was talking with was getting pretty upset. And so I ended the conversation there. It got kind of awkward there for a little bit. But anyway, and that's why the distinction between proof and persuasion is so important. I try to be careful, right? Trying to be sensitive to the person being really loyal to the speaker and trying to disentangle the loyalty and trying to keep it objective. And eventually, after several times of talking, I was able to make some headway. However, it was difficult at first. So when we're talking about arguments, when you're learning logic, it's key to understand the distinction between proof and persuasion. Proof concerns reality. Proof concerns arguments. There is no bending. Proofs are rigid. They make their case or they don't. Persuasion concerns the hearer. And that can bend. Persuasion can be bended. It can be bended by emotion or attachment, insecurity, admiration, fear, desire, so on and so forth. So we must always ask ourselves, we're trying to become more philosophical, more logical, so that we can think better, right? So we have a Thomistic mind. Again, that's what this is about, right? This is the Thomistic Mind broadcast, and we're trying to have a Thomistic mind, whether you're Catholic or not, but because this is probably, we have a lot of Catholic listeners, right? This is what it means to think like a Catholic. It's what it means to take every thought captive and make it obedience to Christ, is to learn the distinction between an objective argument versus subjective persuasion. So when I'm thinking about something, I need to ask, am I accepting this because it is a good argument, it's been proven, or because I just happen to find it persuasive, I happen to find it something agreeable with me, right? It's appealing to my prejudice, for example. And having a Thomistic mind, having a mature mind, it needs to know that difference. Knows the difference between something being proven and argued and someone being persuaded. Okay, hopefully that really helps you think about things, how you ponder things, how you think about things. Okay. Some other aspects of an argument. So we're gonna get deeper into understanding the nature of argument. So, an argument, if correctly understood, then does this objectively prove the conclusion, right? arguments are objective because either the conclusion is true, and it has to be true for two reasons. So in an argument, if you structure it correctly, it does demonstrate the conclusion if two things are true. One, because the premises are true, and three, and just as important, that conclusion of the argument follows those premises. So first, formally understanding argument. Okay, so this is sort of jargony, but that's okay. Formally put, the rational function of an argument is to justify its conclusion by offering premises that provide support or reasons for accepting it. I'll say that again. The rational function, the rational objective function, task of an argument is to justify, to warrant that the conclusion is true. How? By offering premises that provide support or reason for accepting it. Again, what's coming up, I'm going to be looking at some of Jesus's arguments. And so again, I'm just giving you, the terminology. I'm just giving you some of the concepts so that when we dive into certain things about Jesus's teaching, because I'm going to use that as an example, you'll find it really helpful and very interesting. Or we could take a more informal understanding of argument. An argument, informally said, would be an argument aims to convince you of its conclusion by using its premises as supporting reasons. Right? The informal presentation is, or statement is, an argument aims to convince you of its conclusion by using its premises as supporting reasons. Okay. Next, another distinction. We need to distinguish between statements that need an argument from those that don't. What am I saying here? Well, I'm trying to get you to see that here, I've told you what an argument is, and arguments are trying to show that the conclusion is true because of the premises. What I want to discuss now is when should an argument be given, because sometimes arguments can make things more complicated. Right? If something is more obvious, then if you want to give an argument for it, you have to use something that's less obvious. And so any good student of logic knows that not all statements need an argument. Some statements do need arguments. Well, what's the difference? Okay, well, there are some statements, sometimes, given the context, that we can see that they are true or false simply by considering them. That is, they are what philosophers name self-evident statements. Here's some examples of statements that don't need arguments. I'm happy with my grade. Well, that doesn't need an argument. You know you're happy by just ask yourself. Yeah, I'm pretty happy. Trees or plants. Does that need an argument? Right. War causes pain and suffering. True. Cheese is a dairy product. True. Des Moines is the capital of Iowa. True. Right. You might be thinking, well, and water is wet. Right. Well, these are self-evident. Right. If you're a native Iowan growing up, are you going to write a paper that Des Moines is the capital? Are you going to write an article that Des Moines is the capital? Right. You might tell your friend who is maybe visiting the state, but in certain contexts, that's just obvious. You don't argue for that. If you're from the great state of Wisconsin, you grow up in a certain environment. Cheese is a dairy product. You don't need arguments for that. Right? Everyone knows that war causes suffering. So again, these are statements that are self-evident, and therefore they wouldn't be conclusions. Is the point I'm making? These aren't going to be conclusions. Okay, if you've just joined us, we're coming to the very end of today's talk. We're looking at argument, the nature of argument. And I think we've had some really interesting distinctions and stories and illustrations. And I really hope that you're finding this meaningful. I really hope that you're listening and going back and watching the episode again or listening to it again and just thinking about, man, I have never thought about things like this. I've never thought about giving an argument this way. I never thought about the difference between, or maybe I have, but not this deep about persuasion and proof. And I need to be more attentive to that distinction. I never heard about self-evident statements. I never heard about things that seem to be obviously true. Even the nature of obvious isn't obvious. Now, not to be too confusing. One of my favorite students that I had at the seminary a long time ago did their dissertation on just what is obvious. Just really interesting. Of course, this former student of mine has got a PhD. He's doing a very good job teaching. He's a sharp guy. But I can only imagine him telling his friends, what are you writing your dissertation on? Oh, just what does it mean for something to be obvious? Well, isn't that obvious? No, that's the paradox. There's nothing obvious about the obvious. Anyway, there's a distinction between things that are self-evident and things that are not self-evident. And so, when we're going to give an argument, so here's the takeaway. What's the point I'm making, the overarching point of all this? You're only going to give an argument for when you need to have reasons for thinking that they're true. That is, for most statements, for most things that we are considering, whether they're true or false, for most statements we're going to consider their truth or falsity because there are reasons for thinking that they are true, or there are reasons for thinking they are false. And of course, what are these reasons? They're going to be premises. For example, let's consider some of these statements. The sum of the squares of the legs, two legs of a right triangle, equals the square of the remaining side. What? I'm going to need an argument for that. A school should have policy P on AI use among students. Well, you're going to have to give an argument for why that policy is something that we should do. The rate a country should tax its citizens is X. You're going to need to get an argument for that. Even politicians should give an argument for that. Parents should never allow their high school children to have a smartphone. Is that self-evident? Maybe some people it is self-evident. But most, especially a teenager, you're going to need to give them an argument. Or even more ultimate questions like, God exists. Humans have free will. Our dead are in heaven. Jesus Christ rose from the dead. So on and so forth. And so these are statements. You start just considering them. You're thinking, why would I think that's true? It's not obvious to me that these are true. There are books written on these things defending these things. And so these statements, because I can't see whether they're true or false just by considering them, I need to have something that can help me see that they're true. And the things that help us to see that these statements are true, to see that God exists, to see that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, to see that the high school student should have a smartphone, those reasons are the premises, which means, and this is a conclusion, the premises of an argument are statements these are statements whose truth or falsity is easier to see than the conclusion. That is, the premises, seeing their truth or falsity is going to be easier than seeing the conclusion. Well, that wraps up this episode on the Thomistic Mind with Dr. Jason Reed. I am Dr. Jason Reed, professor of philosophy at Divine Word College Seminary, and a part-time lecturer in the permanent diaconate program, the Archdiocese of Dubuque. Please think about these things. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. You've been listening to The Thomistic Mind with Dr. Jason Reed, produced by Mr. Matt Graham. To learn more about our rigorous philosophy courses, visit us online at www.readthomas.com. www.reedthomist.com. It's been a privilege to journey with you through the world of philosophy, seeking truth, goodness, and beauty together. My hope is that today's conversation encourages you to think more deeply, live more wisely, and love more fully. Until next time, keep your mind fixed on the truth and your heart set on the highest good.